Is Australia's property bubble going to blow? In today's video, we're going to be talking about Australian property and whether we're in a bubble. Now, I've heard that Australia's property market has been described as a giant Ponzi scheme. And that was by a guy called Steve McKnight who'd bought hundreds of properties over a very short period of time. Now, I do tend to agree. We are potentially living in a giant Ponzi scheme here in Australia. The government, the systems, the state governments, the local governments, the buyers, the immigration, they're all impacting Australia's property market. Now, before we go any further, I hate to break it to you, I don't think Australia's property bubble is going to burst. And I'm going to be sharing 5 reasons why I think that's the case. So make sure you stick around to understand what's going on in Australia's property market. Now, factor number 1 is Australia's financial system is actually very stable. People complain a lot about the banks, a lot about the big 4 banks, a lot about the RBA, a lot about how Australia's economy is run. But if you look at Australia and compare us to the rest of the world, we live in an amazing country and we have an amazing financial system that is relatively stable. One of the things that impacts this most significantly is the way credit policy is managed. We have competition here in Australia's credit markets. We don't just have the big 4 banks. We have a lot of mid-tier lenders, third-tier lenders, and Australians are vetted heavily when it comes to receiving a loan. Now, everyone will remember the GFC about banks getting greedy in the United States, writing these loans on properties that people couldn't repay, but Australia's market is a lot stricter and a lot tighter when it comes to its credit policy. And so this has allowed more stability in the market because most people who can repay the loans are receiving the loans, rather than people who can't pay the loans receiving loans when it comes to buying property. One of the more recent events that you may remember was the Royal Commission into the financial services industry between 2017 and 2019. And this actually put more restrictions on banks' lending policies after this Royal Commission. An example of that was the buffers that were used by the banks. Now banks are using a 3% buffer, but historically they were able to use a 2% buffer. So things have become more conservative in Australia's credit policy. And this actually reduces the likelihood of an Australian property bubble bursting because we're unlikely to have a major collapse across the board. The other thing is that a lot of Australian property doesn't even have a mortgage attached to it. You can think of the baby boomers or the Gen Xers who basically have no mortgages on their property. And what this means is if you look at Australia's property market in terms of its entire valuation and the total debt in Australia's property market, there's only about a 25% LVR, which means about 25% of the total valuation is actual debt in Australia's market. Now, this might not be the case if you've got your own home or you're starting to build your property portfolio. You might have 80 or 90% LVRs. But if you look at Australia as a whole, with such a low LVR in around the 25% mark across Australia's entire market, this actually reduces the risk of, again, a property bubble bursting. The next major factor that means Australia's bubble might not burst is one that's been talked about a lot recently in the news, and that is population. We're seeing here in Southeast Queensland, overseas and interstate migration. And this is driving people into Australia's property markets. It's not only important to have enough properties for the number of people in this country, it's also important to have enough properties in the right locations, which is why I'm a buyer's agent here in Greater Brisbane, because I believe that Brisbane is an area primed for growth over the mid to long term, and I'm a longer term investor at the core. Now, if you look at Brisbane's fundamentals, we don't have enough housing for the people that want to live here. And so if you look at the supply and demand equation, that means property prices will continue to rise. Now, if you look at the data from 2022, there was around 454,000 migrants moving into Australia, and that was net migration. So of the people moving in and out, we had an additional 454,000 people come into Australia. This was the highest level of net overseas migration since 1996. And it's expected that hundreds of thousands of migrants will continue to come into the country year after year over the next 20 years out until 2042. The Australian government is even projecting that Australia's population will land between 37 to 49 million people by 2026. And that purely means we need to create more dwellings, even high density, medium density, and low density dwellings in the locations these people want to live. Now, a lot of these overseas migrants will initially start in the Sydney and Melbournes. Those are the major hubs here in Australia. But over time, they'll move to the Brisbanes, the Perths, the Adelaides, and the large major regional towns. So if you could buy an area with that limited land supply, that's a scarce resource, and we continue to have this population growth, this again supports Australia's property bubble not bursting. Now this leads me into point number 3, which is the limited supply here in Australia's market. There are so many factors that play into our limited supply story here in Australia. The things that come to top of mind are materials and labour. We are generally in a material shortage, although things are getting better. And we also are generally in a skilled labour shortage of people who can build houses in the right trades as well. So carpenters, electricians, plumbers, roofers, the trades that people need to actually go out there and build properties, which is why tradies make such good money, or most tradies do, not apprentices. We also have to consider land supply. So what are the local governments allowing property developers to actually develop on? And do we have zoning issues or constraints placed on these developers? With such a high cost of construction, key point number 4 is around Australia's job market. Now, over the last decade, Australia has had strong employment growth. We've also had low unemployment, and wages are starting to inflate over time. Now, people will argue that wages aren't keeping up with prices and inflation, which is true if you look at the data, but generally there's opportunity for people to significantly increase their wages if they become skilled workers. I can think about engineers, accountants, lawyers, those types of professions which have a large scale for people to increase their wages over time with experience, allow them the opportunity to get lending. So without a good wage, you're not going to be able to get access to lending. So you do need a day job income to support you building a property portfolio or getting into buying your first home. But Australia is a great place to do this, to increase your wage over time. We're one of the most developed countries in the world, and there is access to opportunity here. If you're watching my videos here on YouTube, you have access to a world of knowledge that a lot of people don't have. And so you're able to get education here in Australia, you're able to grow personally and professionally and increase your wages over time. It's about adding value to your employer, to get yourself upskilled, and to ask for a wage increase year on year. So because you get a job, I get a job, lots of people get a job here in Australia, that means we have the capacity, and Australia's society generally has the capacity to buy their own home. Now it is becoming a lot more common that most households need dual incomes. Now the key thing here is it's about trying to find that balance. It's not easy. School expenses, house expenses, life expenses, it does all add up. But if you can use your dual incomes as part of your serviceability, especially before you have kids, then you can potentially break into the market sooner and potentially allow yourself to buy a couple of investments before more expenses come into your life. So because there's so many jobs in Australia's market and we're fairly well paid compared to the rest of the world, this is another reason why Australia's property bubble won't burst. Now, the 5th point is that we are owner-occupiers. Australians love their castle. Isn't that the truth? And because Australians love their castle, they want to have the pool room, they want to have their barbecue and sit off the back deck and enjoy their own home. Because we have that great Australian dream of owning our own property, it's very driven in our society for people to want to buy a home. And what this means is because the Australian property market is dominated by owner-occupiers, this supports property prices. Based on the 2021 census, around 67.5% of properties across Australia were owner-occupied. Now, owner-occupiers tend to be stickier than investors and renters. They also want to invest in their home by adding value, by adding the back deck, by adding some bedrooms underneath and doing some renovations. And this, again, puts money into the property market. So the 5th point in today's discussion is that owner-occupiers help support Australia's property market and, again, the bubble not bursting. Now, I've heard about doomsday predictions for the last 20 years. I even recall as a child when I was growing up, my parents chatting about property prices and whether the market was going to tank at a period of time. And the property market does have ebbs and flows. It does have ups and downs. And we have seen record high prices across a lot of the cities in the last few months, given the growth we've seen in 2023. And I think there's going to be growth in 2024 if you look at these factors, looking at the credit policy, looking at the population growth, looking at the limited supply, looking at the available access and serviceability because people have jobs, and looking that we're in an owner-occupied dominated market. To me, if you understand those factors, it all points to Australian property prices increasing. Now, this does become a difficult topic because a lot of people are struggling at this point in time. I remember when we first got married, we had about $5,000 to our name, if that. We scrimped and saving $10,000 or $15,000 a year was a massive amount for us. After we were able to consistently do that year on year, we were able to build up our deposit and break into the property market. And that's when our snowball began. So if you're thinking the property market looks bleak and you're worried about these price increases, just know you can take the little steps to work towards you buying your own home or buying your next investment. Now, if you want to pick up our course, Invest with Purpose, to learn about building a multi-million-dollar property portfolio, head over to purposeproperty.com.au and use the code 15OFF to get that discount today. And if you want to sit down and have a chat with myself about buying a property here in the Brisbane market over the next 6 months, head over to purposeproperty.com.au and book in a free strategy session with myself. Thanks for sticking around. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.